Hello, it's Lawrence Romanowski from Calgary, Canada, and the Soleil EV Buyer's Guide, the link of which is below, which is a publication I've been working on for the last few months, which has identified all the EVs for sale in Canada, what's incoming, and various articles on the terminology and capacity and measures of the electric vehicles to hopefully allow you to better compare one EV to another and an EV to an internal combustion engine car. We've done videos on battery size and range, on consumption, on power, on charging, long one on AC and DC. And for this one, I thought I would try to wrap it up a little bit and give my advice on how to compare one EV to the next. And so the first thing that I'll say is that in many respects they're not that different from one another, and hear me out on this. So if you're a manufacturer building EVs, you're going to want to start with a battery pack. Well, there's only a few suppliers of battery packs, Panasonic and LG. You'll decide to some extent on the composition of those battery cells, whether they're focused on fast power delivery or longevity. Okay, and for most passenger cars, it'll be longevity. You'll put that battery pack in the most obvious place, which is the floor of the vehicle, in between the axles, as low down and central as possible for the best handling and packaging. You'll then take this one platform and try to spin off a bunch of versions. So you would have a two-wheel drive version and an all-wheel drive version. The electric motors are going to be in line with the axles. So you would generally have a two-motor all-wheel drive or a single motor, mostly rear-wheel drive, but it could be front-wheel drive too. In most cases, the two-wheel drive variant is the rear wheels, which is a different from the combustion engines. But anyway, you'd have one motor or two motors. You would have all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. Sorry, all-wheel drive or two-wheel drive. Then you would size the motors, and the manufacturers don't make those either. So you'd go to Bosch or whoever it is who makes the motors, and then they would have them in 100, 125, 150, 200 kilowatt versions. And you'd say, okay, well, give me a couple of 125 kilowatt motors. You'd supply those, put them in the axles. There's no gearboxes. There's one gear reduction because the electric motor will spin faster than the wheels. So you'll gear down the electric motor on each axle, and that's that. There's your powertrain. You will have to specify the inverters from AC to DC and add those power electronics, also provided by a supplier. Maybe to your specs, but to a supplier, and that's it. That's the powertrain for the electric car. And a lot of these car manufacturers are in conglomerates. So a Kia and a Hyundai are going to share a platform, and a VW and a Seat and a small Audi are going to share a platform. The larger Audi EVs and the Porsche share a platform. So some of these platforms will be identical between marques. Okay, some of them might have some slight changes in software or possibly even some of the battery cells, but they'll kind of be the same. And there aren't too many suppliers for any of these components. Okay, so one EV skateboard isn't going to be that much different than the other EV skateboard. Okay, and one's not going to be that much more efficient. And they're going to have, virtually the same range related to the same battery capacity. Okay, so the manufacturer then picks, we'll do a smaller battery and a larger battery, maybe a 60 and 80 or an 80 and 100. They'll clothe it with an aerodynamic body. We'll try to put low rolling resistance tires in it. They'll have some leeway with what brake regeneration strategy they use, whether it's one pedal or whether they want, in other words, whether when you lift off the throttle it automatically brakes, or whether when you lift off the throttle it coasts and it waits for you to put your foot on the brake, then regenerates the battery. There's some software that'll control how much of the battery is usable how much is walled off in the interest of durability. So there's not that much difference in all of these EV skateboards. They're all going to be about the same price too. Okay, so what's left? Well, there's the styling, and that's subjective, and that's up to you to decide. There could be small differences in packaging, but with the battery and the motors taking up the floor of the vehicle and the powertrain, we're all going to have similar packaging. Okay. The one big difference that I see is power electronics, and that is how the vehicle manages AC and DC power. The voltage of it, which I've talked about in a previous video, whether it's 400 volt and 800 volt. The most sophisticated EVs will be 800 volt. This will allow them to charge the fastest. It will allow them to use the full charge capability of the Electrify Canada and Electrify America charging stations. It'll allow them to charge up to 250 or 300 kilowatts, double the rate of charge of the 400 volt ones. Okay, so that is a key thing, whether it's 400 volt or whether it's 800 volt, I would say. Okay, the capacity of the onboard chargers differs materially. There are some EVs that are similar priced that can charge DC at only 50 kilowatts. Some are 150 kilowatts. Well, with the smaller one, that's 3 times as long on a road trip that you're waiting for your car to charge. Okay, so that's important. When you get the EV, you're going to want to know the maximum AC charge rate. You're going to want to know the maximum DC charge rate. You're going to want to know the maximum DC charge rate at 400 volt Petro-Canada stations and the maximum DC charge rate at 800 volt Electrify Canada stations. Okay, so the ability to the car to accept DC is one thing, and it's dependent on which charging station you use. So you're going to want to know you're going to want to know how fast your car can recharge wherever you are to recharge it. How fast is it at home to recharge? How fast is it at a 400 volt DC fast charging station like Petro-Canada? How fast is it going to charge at an 800 volt Electrify Canada station? So you're going to want to know that and compare it to other EVs. And that's one area where the EVs do differ. If you're plugging it in at home and driving it in the city, which most people are, maybe some of those differences aren't important. But the few times you decide to do a road trip, being able to charge your car in half the time as the next person might be meaningful to you. Okay, so that would be important. That's something I'd look at. Some of the new EVs also offer bi-directional charging. In other words, you can, obviously every EV you can charge, but on some cars, they have the ability to use the EV to charge other appliances, including another electric vehicle. Okay, so Volkswagen said that all their cars from 2022 will have bi-directional charging. I know the Nissan Leaf has bi-directional charging. Hyundai's advertising that for their new 800 volt Ioniq 5. Okay, and that could be important. For instance, if you run into another EV where it needs a charge, instead of hauling it off on a flat deck, you can stop on the side of the road and give the person or your wife a charge so they can get going. You could go camping with the thing and power a bunch of electrical accessories or whatever. So that would be pretty useful, and they'll charge at a rate of, I think, 3 or 4 kilowatts, which is substantial. Okay, so bi-directional charging is a thing. The capacity of the power inverters is a thing. The onboard power or the onboard charger capacities is a thing. All of that gets lumped into, what I call power electronics, which isn't necessarily what most manufacturers talk about, because they'll talk about, the size of the battery or maybe the power, but not actually the electronics which govern it, which I would argue are more important than the actual powertrain, which are all fairly ubiquitous. Okay, so there's that. The first generation EVs that are kind of on dealer lots now are generally derivatives of combustion engine cars that were kind of modified to make an EV. That doesn't make them bad, but for instance, they wouldn't have a flat floor with a battery pack because the combustion car wouldn't have that, okay? So they would have been designed to accept, like Hyundai's current cars, the Ioniq and the Kona and so on. They would have a version that's gasoline, they would have a version that's a hybrid, and they would have a version that's a pure EV. And the difference would be that the gas tank is taken out of the car and replaced with a battery pack that's kind of, you know, in the same shape. Well, that's not ideal, but it does give the advantage that it brings the cost down because the development's shared over, you know, many more vehicles. And those cars now generally have some incentives, manufacturer dealer incentives if they're on the lot, and they would be the lower end of the entry point for getting an EV, and especially with government rebates and so on. So that could make a big difference. And, you know, you can buy, you know, one of these cars for $35,000 or something like that. A new generation all-wheel drive EV with a flat battery pack and, you know, all-wheel drive and 300 kilowatts, well, that might be $70,000 or $80,000. So I wouldn't say that the current EVs are a bad thing. Just realize that those designs will be probably obsolete pretty soon, and you know, you might think about leasing that car and giving it back rather than owning it, just because you don't know what's going to happen to the residual value once, you know, that design becomes obsolete, and it will become obsolete. Okay. With a greater production of EVs, it just makes sense to optimize the design for EV only. And generally, I don't know of any new EVs that are coming now that are based on internal combustion engine cars. A little bit maybe, but not compromised in the same way. So then, when you're looking at buying one, I would say, you know, you might have been a fan of a particular marque because you like the engines, or they might have, you know, they might have a certain characteristics that appeal to you. But now that everybody's making EVs, I think it's time to sort of take a step back and reevaluate it, and maybe lose some of those associations that you may have had, whether one car is bad and you never considered it, or you've always bought a certain marque and never considered anything else. You know, I think it's time to probably take a step back and have a closer look. Like, for instance, you know, I was around when Hyundai made their first Pony, and you know, it was kind of a laughing stock of a car. Well, now the Hyundais and the Kias with 800-volt architecture and all-wheel drive and sophisticated designs and so on, and you know, bi-directional charging and 250 kilowatt DC charging capability. Well, that's a state-of-the-art EV now in some attractive cars. So I wouldn't have necessarily been shopping for a Hyundai, but their new EV, well, you know, it'd definitely be something to look at. I mean, something like a Porsche, if you've always liked Porsches, you're certain to like the new Taycan, so you can just move right into that if you can afford it. And there are other makes that are maybe a little bit behind. Like, you've always bought Toyotas, they don't have an EV right now, or Hondas for that matter. So I would it's just time for a fresh look. The way we you know, measure them, the units of measurement, all that, it's all changing. So with that, I hope that was helpful. Please like and subscribe. We'll continue this video series on EVs. Please have a look at the buyer's guide. We'll develop and run with it over the coming months and years, and hopefully make it a definitive source for EVs in Canada and in the US too. Thank you very much. Lawrence Romanowski from Calgary, Canada.